I'm Ben Wattenberg. President Clinton has declared that the era of big government is over. Is it? Will something take its place? Many intellectuals from across the political spectrum point to civil society. They say that America must strengthen its neighborhoods, families, civic clubs, churches, and schools. Some say this is a new job for the government, and as usual, others say the government is the problem. Joining us to sort through the conflict and the consensus are William Galston, former Deputy Assistant to President Clinton for Domestic Policy and now a professor at the School of Public Affairs at the University of Maryland. Don Eberly, Director of the Civil Society Project and author of Restoring the Good Society, a New Vision for Culture and Politics. David Boaz, Executive Vice President of the Cato Institute, and Daniel Lazare, author of The Frozen Republic, How the Constitution is Paralyzing Democracy. The topic before this House, can civil society be restored? This week on Think Tank. A 150 years ago, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in his classic work, Democracy in America, that Americans of all ages, all stations of life, and all types of disposition are forever forming associations, religious, moral, serious, futile, very general, very limited, immensely large, and very minute. And it's still true today. More than any other people, Americans are joiners and activists. We join everything from labor unions, parent-teacher associations, and church groups to bowling leagues. Together, these clubs, groups, and organizations make up what social scientists call civil society. But, as noted in a widely publicized article, Bowling Alone, America's Declining Social Capital, Harvard's Robert Putnam argues that participation in civic groups has dropped dramatically in recent decades. Weekly church-going, parent-teacher associations, union membership, Boy Scout volunteers, women's organizations, all down. If Americans are dropping out of civil society, why? Women have joined the workforce in ever greater numbers. People are spending more time watching television at home alone. But some analysts argue that civil society withered as big government took over more and more of the activities that voluntary civic institutions once handled. Bill Galston, is civil society in trouble in America today?
I think the evidence is pretty clear, Ben. Whether you look at the smallest platoons of civil society, namely families, neighborhood associations, civic groups, PTAs, larger organizations, the trend over the past 30 or 40 years has been unmistakably down. And it seems to me we've come to a point where we should stop arguing about the facts and start arguing about what to do about this situation.
Okay, Daniel Lazare, is the civil society in trouble?
I agree. I think it's the amazing thing about American society is how atomized it's become over the last half century. I mean, Americans are increasingly a lonely, isolated breed who watch politics on TV and go everywhere in the private car and for diversity, go to shopping malls.
Don Eberly, is civil society in trouble? You're all getting the same question first.
I think civil society is in trouble. We should probably be very clear about what we're talking about. We're not just talking about some alternative set of institutions or some private sector that we put some load off onto from the government. We're really talking about, I think, to use an alternative concept, the state of American social capital or human capital. The capacity of individuals increasingly to achieve well-being in society, to achieve durable relationships, to negotiate their way along a competitive society, to basically make things work both in the context of their own families and in the neighborhood. And I would say that that's where one would want to be most concerned.
Okay, that's three yes answers to the pessimistic view. David Boaz?
Yes, I agree with that. I would say civil society is everything in society except the government. It is families, neighborhoods, businesses, I think, can be included, the market, civic associations, and as the government's gotten bigger over the last 30 years, civil society's been squeezed out. If the government is providing prenatal care and feeding kids and caring for the elderly and teaching kids about sex in school, what's left for mediating institutions to do?
Well, I know, Bill Galston, you said we shouldn't argue about the facts, but let's just argue about the facts very briefly. For example, consider amateur softball. Okay, in the mid-1970s, 26 million Americans participated. Today, it's almost twice that amount, 42 million. There were 66,000 teams. There are now 202,000 teams. And there are a lot of other examples. I mean, I think, for example, this whole computer explosion where you have this plethora of so-called chat rooms, is that an atomization, as Dan Lazare says, or is that a virtual community?
I think that the data that Putnam and others have collected in recent years is pretty clear. In the aggregate, the membership overall in civic organizations has declined. The amount of time spent by average individuals and families has declined. There has indeed been a move towards the privatization of our culture. I personally believe, with Putnam and others, that television has a lot to do with that.
It's difficult to say that a big diverse society like the United States can be characterized in one way. I think you're right. I think one of the things that computer networks are showing us is that community isn't always geographical. There's a place for geographical community, but we can also participate in broader communities, professional, interest-oriented, fan clubs on the internet, associations of Black Americans across the country, gay Americans, different people who associate in different ways, who might not live in a neighborhood with people like that, but can find other people who share their interests on the internet. There's something to that. On the other hand, it is very different from personal interaction. It's not the same thing as sitting down with a group of people and getting the kind of signals and the kind of closeness that you get in personal situations.
Yeah, there's no question America is physically more isolated. Americans are physically more isolated than they were a half century ago. I mean, our towns are configured differently. We don't live around, town centers. We don't walk. We tend to drive. We tend to shop in shopping malls, as I said before. A lot of our...
what is wrong with shopping malls? I mean, shopping malls are non-virtual communities. People from all the surrounding suburbs come together and they shop and they schmooze and they go to coffee shops and...
A shopping mall is a sort of a one-dimensional totalitarian space. I mean,
excuse me?
A one-dimensional totalitarian space.
The last one I was in was three-dimensional.
Well, it's really one-dimensional in terms of social discourse, because the only thing you can do at a shopping mall is shop, essentially.
There may be a point that's not being made explicitly here, and that is that whether one looks at suburbia and the architecture there, or the mall, which is so popular, especially with kids, what you're doing is reinforcing anonymity and individual autonomy. Everything is about the self, and I think what we're dealing with in this whole discussion about civil society is what do you do in a society in which for decades now we have celebrated a form, at least, of extreme individualism or liberal individualism that celebrates only the individual in isolation making choices, whether it's choices in the marketplace or moral choices, depending upon where you're coming from. And we have lost an ethos in this country and a public philosophy in this country that emphasizes something that we once unashamedly talked about as the common good or the public space. And maybe that's what I think what people react to today when you sense the incivility and harsh and mean edge that you encounter in the malls or at the intersections on our highways or in campgrounds is the sense that you can't go anywhere anymore without the individual self being, in a sense, the only driving reality, that everybody has this sense that he or she now is the sovereign and with rights and entitlements and entitled to any amount of space.
David Boaz, as a libertarian, you would applaud that, I assume.
Well, I don't necessarily applaud all aspects of it, but yes, America is the most individualist country in the world, and it was founded on the notion of individual rights. But individualism doesn't mean what academics sometimes call atomistic individualism. The most individualist country in the world is the one that de Tocqueville wrote about, forming more associations than anybody else. So I don't think there has to be this conflict between individualism and liberation of the self and community and civic values. I don't think that dichotomy holds.
Individualism today, wouldn't you agree, is very close to being an atomistic individualism, and it's dangerous to democratic society.
Yes, I think there is a sense in which that's true, and I think a lot of it is because government has gotten so big that there's not very much left between the federal government and the atomistic individual.
I think this tendency to counterpose individualism to government is really is mistaken. I mean, I think that people, a democratic people, builds individualism collectively. It sounds paradoxical, but I think it's really true. Acting collectively, we create individual space. The problem with America today is not that we have too much individualism, but we have too little individualism. A shopping mall, I think, truncates individualism by forcing us into a narrow, consumerist, commercial mode. I think the problem with America today is that its politics are in a state of breakdown. And as politics break down, society breaks down as well. And the reason for that, I believe, is that we have a drastically outmoded 18th century constitution, which is just woefully unsuited to the problems of a late 20th century
And you would
society.
propose what?
I propose to change
in
it.
its stead. How?
To radically democratize it. I'm a believer in majoritarianism, and I propose to substitute majority rule for the elaborate system of checks and balances and separation of powers we have now.
Ben, this is where I think the whole conversation is really kind of unfortunate about civil society, because I think the political system is broken. It's not about to fix itself, and even if you did fix it along the lines being suggested here, it would take you maybe 5 or 10% of the distance in terms of where we want to go in renewing community and renewing functional neighborhoods and restoring some sense of moral consensus in America and rebuilding moral and social capital in this country. That's the problem. And one of the reasons that a lot of intelligent Americans are checking out of politics is because you cannot and will not sense the degree of efficacy that people are looking for today by connecting with politics, and especially national politics. I could have it my way, the communitarians could have it their way, the libertarians could have it their way, and it would not deal with the underlying social crisis that we have in this country.
What are you proposing?
And I'll get to that in a second, but what the opinion polls are increasingly revealing is that people now have figured this out. This isn't just about the state, whether you want it this big or that big or this big or whatever else. This is about the collapse of things that you might define as communal, familial, and spiritual even, according to Frank Luntz's recent polls. What would I do? I would encourage on a large scale what's already happening, and I think we're on the verge of very large scale renewal, which is essentially speaks to the spiritual and moral and communitarian aspects of American life. My point here is only that the public aspirations that they seem to have now for politics will not be satisfied. In fact, it's dangerous to sustain them and to raise them higher, such as I think he's...
You are saying it's not politics, stupid.
It's not politics. It's just simply not politics.
Oh, okay. Now, Bill Galston, two of your colleagues in this panel from, I think, different perspectives have said that politics is broken. Are politics broken?
Oh, I think that the gridlock in Washington has given a lot of people a justified impression that the political system isn't working the way they want it to. The question is whether you can infer from that the conclusion that politics is irreparably broken and is irrelevant to the question of civil society. And I think the answer to that question is no. I have my own program, but let me just give you one example before I get to that, as to the relationship between politics and civil society. You can't really have public activities unless you have public spaces that people are able to go to and walk in and live in and argue in. And one of the things that's happened in this country in the past 30 years is that more and more people have grown more and more afraid of the public spaces, and so they've retreated from them. Now, who defends the public spaces against nuisances like noise pollution and against threats to public safety? That is government. And because government has failed to discharge one of the most elementary responsibilities of government, namely the maintenance of public order, civil society has suffered. So I don't think we should buy into the simple proposition that that civil society will wax as government wanes. The relationship is much more complicated than that.
Well, I think that's a very important point, and what we're talking about
But
as
that's
far
a
as
government point.
That is the government, and listen, that's not
Right.
unimportant. When I sort of distinguish between prudent policy reforms that are underway now, the so-called Republican revolution or devolution that is moving a lot of authority downward and outward, those are prudent and important reforms, necessary and inevitable, I might add, reforms. They're coming, whether or not whoever you elect this year to the presidency, they're coming. This is the direction history is moving. The problem is the things that we want to, if recreate is the term, want to recreate in America, they are not the kinds of things that are born or reborn by virtue of what government does or stops doing. They originate in something deeper, the seedbeds of virtue. The Founding Fathers were very clear about this. Our liberal democratic institutions presupposed the constant supply to our society of citizens who were capable of self-governance and acting out of respect for and in affection for their neighbors, for fellow citizens.
And your view is that the federal government has crowded out a lot of that.
Displacement is a big part of this, and I don't want to downplay that. It's a very important part of this, and I think that's what we're talking about when we're talking about government doing
Dan
no
Lazare,
harm or
you would not
devolving.
agree with that.
Well, first of all, on a historical note, let me say that James Madison may have believed that, but the other founding father, the other co-author of the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton, did not believe that. Hamilton was a statist and a believer in sovereign government, and he believed in a very different kind of government than what we have now.
Are you a statist?
Oh, well, I'm not a statist in the sense I'm not a militarist, even though I believe in the military. But I do believe a state is an essential instrument for organizing society. And I think attacking it, just as it is
more
crazy.
so than we now see it.
Oh yeah, I believe the era of big government is just getting underway. And also, I might say, also,
Welcome
I think
to our civil
I'm also,
here,
by the
right.
way, a centralist too. I believe, I think this devolution is just know-nothingism.
How do you overcome atomization through centralization? I mean,
By building a society as a whole, creating a coherent society as a whole, and allowing individuals then to fill in the blanks.
But Dan, we can't all have an intimate relationship with everyone else in America, and an intimate relationship with an alien and increasingly powerful federal government. That's the problem with this kind of centralization and majoritarianism. All the power goes to one central authority in Washington, and then we don't have the power to solve problems in our local communities, in our states, in the private sector.
But why is government of the people, by the people, and for the people alien?
I don't know what this of
Why
the people,
should it
by
be?
the people. In the first place, you never really get majority rule in a country of 250 million people. You're always going to have special interest groups. I mean, read the iron law of oligarchy or the public choice economists. It just doesn't work that 51% of us get together and think, we should have stronger fatherhood, so we're going to pass a national fatherhood law.
Right.
Fatherhood happens by people in individual communities talking about it and understanding responsibility.
But it certainly happens.
Bill Galston, what is the difference between this argument toward devolution to the states that we're hearing so much about and civil society? Is there an overlap there? Or?
I think there is. First of all, devolving to state and local government is not directly the same thing as strengthening civil society, but indirectly. The federal government is the least trusted set of public institutions by far in America today. And as you go down the ladder of federalism, the level of trust increases. And the state of civil society today is in part an effect and in part a cause, I believe, of the enormous escalation of mistrust in this country. So I would put on the table the proposition that anything that you do that helps to build public trust will contribute to an atmosphere in which the activities, the voluntary activities of civil society are more likely to take place. Now let me make a second point. I don't think that the question of the relationship between government and civil society admits of a simple yay or nay answer. I gave an example a few minutes ago of a function
about crime.
Of a function which, if
Security.
if the government fails to perform it adequately, civil society also suffers. On the other hand, a very, very fine sociologist by the name of Alan Wolf, a man to my left on many economic and political questions, wrote a wonderful book a few years ago looking at the United States and Scandinavia and coming to the conclusion that if the welfare state grows beyond a certain point, then the displacement of functions that could be better performed by families or neighborhood associations is in fact a real phenomenon. And I think we have to take both halves of that story equally seriously and ask ourselves what it is that government ought to be doing.
What would your vision of a reformed civil society look like? You don't like shopping malls, so what would you do? Burn them down?
Yes, for my program, I would legalize drugs. I would impose a stiff automobile tax, which would force people to would pedestrianize American society, reinvigorate town centers. I'd pour billions into mass transit. I'd try to strengthen the actual physical infrastructure of urban America. And I'd try to also have a good, well-functioning central government, which would try to strengthen this in other ways as well, and leaving it to people to fill in the blanks.
And you believe, well, aren't they filling in the blanks now? Isn't that what
yes.
we all do every day, all day long?
But unfortunately, the blanks they're filling in are those of breakdown rather than construction and growth.
This is an awfully interesting conversation, and I understand the program is think tank, so it's entirely appropriate that we would be talking mostly about policy, but to the extent that we continue to raise the expectations among the American people that civil society will be reborn as we create the right policies and the right structural changes, which is to say, after we elect the right people to do the project, to do the job that's being described here, then civil society will be reborn. It will be a long time before we have civil society in America.
But my question was, how do you envision
that's right.
A proper civil society? What would it look like? What would it feel like? What would it taste like? How would it be different from what we have today?
The reason this isn't amorphous to the American people is because to them, to most increasingly American people, they're looking at this problem from the standpoint not just of declining trust in public institutions, but declining trust toward each other. What we need in America is mostly locally based movements to renew community, renew character, to trust-building measures, calling upon the people to do what we've always done in American history, to rebuild community in American society from the bottom up.
David Boaz, do you have a vision of a better, more civil society?
Ben, I think the question, as you're pressing it, reveals the fact that you are still a Democrat, and you think that we should be able to...
Check the time. Yeah, as of right now.
We should be able to describe what society would look like after our policies are implemented.
I didn't say the word policies.
No,
that was brought up by somebody else. I just asked you for your vision.
And my libertarian vision is that I can't describe what things people will invent next year. Unlike Al Gore, I don't think I can create an information superhighway and know what products will be created. And I don't think that I know the shape civil society would take. I will say my program would be restore that brilliant 18th century Constitution that Dan Lazare doesn't like. That means devolving powers back to the state, local, and better yet, private level. Privatize the welfare state, giving people more control over their own money, giving them more responsibility, telling them we expect them to take responsibility for their own lives, and have these conversations on morality and virtue and civil society.
Okay. Bill Galston, you as an advisor to our to the President of the United States, surely you must have a vision as to what this civil society would look like.
Well, whether it's a grand vision, you and the viewers will have to judge, but here are two pieces of it. Number one, local institutions, including religious institutions, would be empowered to deal with a range of problems now being dealt with by the state. And I think we should experiment. Senator Coates and Bill Bennett have put a very challenging set of proposals on the table as to how government could actually encourage the invigoration of those local voluntary institutions, and I think we have to look very carefully at those proposals. Idea number two, I think after we conceptually separate government, civil society, and the market, we ought to think about new connections between them. Here's an example for you. In New York City, there are lots of public schools that have turned into community centers. They're open in the morning before school. They're open in the afternoon and evening. Community-based groups not only come together in that public space, but they take responsibility for keeping it clean, for keeping it safe. They take responsibility for encouraging other parents to attend parent-teacher conferences and things of that sort. I think that there is a vision of people coming together, in communities, in common spaces, and and reforging social networks.
Okay, thank you, William Galston, David Boaz, Daniel Lazare, and Don Eberly. And thank you. Our bumper sticker contest for or against President Clinton has inspired hundreds of entries, including Don't Change Stones in Mid-Avalanche and Clinton Gore, more, more, more. If you think you can top these, there's still time. Just submit your original bumper sticker suggestions for or against President Bill Clinton, along with any other comments and questions you may have, to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. We can also be reached by email at thinktv@aol.com or on the World Wide Web at www.thinktv.com. thinktank.com. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.